She humiliated a poor cafe waiter for spilling coffee on her designer suit. But hours later, that same man became the only reason her son survived. And when she learned who he really was, her whole world changed. Vanessa Hale had built her life on control. As the billionaire CEO of one of the city's fastest-growing luxury brands, she was admired in magazines, feared in boardrooms, and followed everywhere by people eager to keep up with her impossible standards. Every detail of her image was curated, from the sleek black car that dropped her off each morning to the designer suits that looked as if they had never known a wrinkle. On the day of the city's most high-profile charity gala, she was already in a foul mood before she even stepped into the crowded downtown cafe. Her assistant had rescheduled 2 meetings without asking, a board member had questioned one of her decisions, and her young son Adrian had refused to go to school without the little toy lion he suddenly could not live without. Vanessa loved her son more than anything in the world, but motherhood often felt like one more responsibility she had to master without ever showing weakness. By the time she pushed open the cafe door, phone pressed to her ear and irritation sharp in every step, she looked like a woman daring the world to disappoint her. The cafe was warm, bustling, and far too loud for her taste. Students crowded the corner tables, office workers hovered by the counter, and the rich smell of espresso floated through the air. Behind the register and weaving through the room with a tray balanced on one hand was Ethan Cole, a man whose exhaustion showed in ways only careful eyes would catch. His shirt was neat but faded, his movements quick but heavy, and though his face was handsome in a rugged, tired sort of way, there was a quiet sadness in him that no amount of polite service could hide. Ethan had already been awake since before sunrise. He had packed his 7-year-old daughter Lily's lunch, walked her to a neighbor before school, finished an early delivery shift, and now stood in the middle of a lunch rush on aching feet, knowing he still had 2 more jobs before the day was done. But when Vanessa Hale stepped to the counter, he greeted her with the same calm courtesy he offered every customer. She barely looked at him. Her focus stayed on the call as she snapped out an order, waved a manicured hand impatiently, and moved aside in her immaculate cream suit, still speaking in the clipped, merciless tone that had made investors both trust and fear her. Ethan prepared the drink as quickly as he could, but just as he turned toward her, another customer backed into him. The cup jolted from his hand. A streak of hot coffee splashed across Vanessa's sleeve in the front of her designer jacket. For one suspended second, the cafe went completely silent. Vanessa stared down at the stain as if it were a personal attack. Slowly she looked up at Ethan, and what rose in her eyes was not surprise, but fury. "Do you have any idea what this suit costs?" she said, her voice cutting through the cafe like glass. Ethan immediately reached for napkins, apologizing in a steady, respectful tone, but Vanessa stepped back as though even his nearness offended her. "No, don't touch me," she snapped, loud enough for every customer to hear. "This is exactly the problem with places like this. No standards, no professionalism, just careless people making messes and expecting everyone else to tolerate it." A few people shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. Ethan stood still, napkins in hand, his face flushing with humiliation. "I'm very sorry, ma'am," he said quietly. "It was an accident. Let me pay for the cleaning." Vanessa gave a cold, disbelieving laugh. "Pay for it? With what? A week's wages?" The words landed like a slap. Several customers looked down at their tables. One young woman near the window frowned openly, but Vanessa, blinded by anger and pride, did not notice. She turned toward the manager who had rushed over in panic. "If this is the kind of staff you employ, I suggest you rethink how you run this place," she said. "People like him shouldn't be anywhere near customers." Ethan lowered his gaze, not because her words were true, but because he had learned long ago that defending himself did not pay bills. He thought of Lily's school shoes with the worn soles, of the rent due in 4 days, of the inhaler prescription he needed to refill before the weekend. Pride was expensive. Silence was practical. So he swallowed the insult and nodded once. Vanessa grabbed a stack of napkins, dabbed at her ruined sleeve with tight, furious movements, and stormed toward the door without another glance. But just before she left, her eyes flicked toward a small drawing taped beside the cafe register, likely placed there by someone's child. It showed a stick figure man holding hands with a little girl under a crooked yellow sun, and below it, written in uneven crayon letters, were the words, "My daddy is my hero." Vanessa looked away almost instantly, too consumed by her own outrage to make anything of it. The door slammed behind her. Noise slowly returned to the cafe, though quieter now, more fragile. The manager muttered something about being careful, then hurried off to attend the line. Ethan knelt to clean the spilled coffee from the floor himself. His hands moved automatically, but inside him a familiar ache spread through his chest. It was not anger. Anger required energy he did not have. It was the old sting of being judged by people who saw only an apron, tired shoes, and bowed shoulders, never the sacrifices beneath them. He finished wiping the floor, rinsed the cloth, and tucked the ruined drawing's corner back into place where the splash had loosened it. Then he straightened, lifted another tray, and went back to work, because that was what fathers like him did. They endured. They kept moving. They let the world underestimate them if it meant their children could sleep safely at night. Ethan did not know that the woman who had just humiliated him would see him again before the day was over, and that the next time their paths crossed, she would no longer be the one holding power. By the time evening settled over the city, Vanessa Hale had managed to bury the humiliation of the morning beneath layers of makeup, a fresh designer gown, and the polished public smile that had made her one of the most photographed women in the business world. The charity gala was being held in the grand ballroom of the Marlowe Hotel, a glittering space filled with crystal chandeliers, string music, and the kind of carefully curated luxury that made wealthy people feel generous while never having to step too close to real struggle. Vanessa moved through the room with practiced elegance, greeting investors, politicians, and board members with the same poised confidence she wore like armor. But inwardly, she was still irritated by the cafe incident and the stain it had left on her mood. At her side was her 8-year-old son, Adrian, dressed in a tiny navy suit, his hair neatly combed, his expression far less polished than his mother's. Adrian had never cared about luxury or reputation. He was a gentle, observant child who often seemed uncomfortable in rooms like this, more interested in the dessert table or a quiet corner than in listening to adults praise his mother's empire. Vanessa loved him fiercely, but she often mistook providing him with the best schools, the best clothes, and the best opportunities for giving him the comfort he truly needed. That night, Adrian clung close to her side as cameras flashed, and strangers bent down to call him adorable. And though Vanessa kept a protective hand on his shoulder, her attention kept being pulled away by donors, speeches, and whispered negotiations about business hidden beneath the language of charity. Across the ballroom, Ethan Cole adjusted the cuffs of a borrowed catering jacket and balanced a silver tray of sparkling drinks with steady hands. After the brutal morning shift at the cafe, he had barely had time to change before rushing to this evening job, one more temporary gig he had accepted because Lily needed new winter shoes and the electric bill was already overdue. He had left his daughter with Mrs. Ramirez downstairs, promised her he would be home before midnight, and kissed the top of her head while she sleepily held up a crayon drawing for him to see. Ethan was exhausted in the way only a parent working beyond his limits could be exhausted. But his body had learned to obey even when his mind begged for rest. The moment he entered the ballroom and saw Vanessa Hale standing beneath the chandeliers in a black evening gown worth more than 3 months of his rent, he almost turned around. Of course she belonged here. She looked like the very spirit of wealth and power, surrounded by people whose smiles were thin and strategic. For one brief second, Ethan wondered if she would recognize him and ask for him to be removed. But Vanessa did not look his way. To her, servers were part of the wallpaper unless they made mistakes. So Ethan kept his head down, moved through the crowd, and did what he always did, his job. The gala reached its peak just before the keynote speech. Waiters circulated with trays of hors d'oeuvres, a quartet played softly near the stage, and donors laughed into champagne glasses while discussing generosity in voices polished by privilege. Adrian had drifted a few steps from his mother toward a tall table set with miniature pastries and bite-sized appetizers. Vanessa noticed, but only from the corner of her eye. She was in the middle of a conversation with a councilman whose support she needed for an upcoming expansion. Adrian reached for a small piece of food from the table, something soft-looking and harmless, and popped it into his mouth. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Then, his face changed. His hand flew to his throat. His eyes widened in confusion, then panic. He tried to cough, but no sound came out.
One second he was standing there quietly, and the next he was choking. The plate he had been holding crashed to the floor. Heads turned. Adrian stumbled backward, both hands clutching his throat, his small face beginning to flush red. Vanessa turned at the sound and saw the terror in her son's eyes. For the first time in years, every ounce of control vanished from her body. "Adrian!" she screamed, rushing to him so fast she nearly slipped on the broken plate. The room froze in horror. A few guests stepped forward, then stopped, useless under pressure. Someone shouted for a doctor. Another person yelled for security, as though authority alone could solve it. Adrian made a desperate, soundless gasp, and Vanessa dropped to her knees in front of him, trying to remember some first aid instructions she had once read and never expected to need. Her hands shook too badly to think. "Help him!" she cried, her voice breaking in a way no one in that room had ever heard before. "Please, somebody help my son!" Ethan was across the ballroom when he saw the commotion, but one look told him everything. He had taken a first aid course years earlier when Lily was a baby, because being alone with a child had taught him to prepare for the worst. He set down his tray so quickly that glasses tipped and rolled across the table, then pushed through the crowd without hesitation. In that moment, he was no longer a waiter in a catering jacket, or a man other people overlooked. He was simply a father who recognized another parent's nightmare. Vanessa barely registered him at first. She just saw someone kneeling beside Adrian with calm, focused hands and an expression that did not carry panic. "He's choking," Ethan said firmly, already positioning the boy. "I need room." There was something in his voice that made people obey instantly. He turned Adrian carefully, checked his airway as best he could, then performed the Heimlich maneuver with precise, controlled movements. Vanessa knelt beside them, trembling, one hand pressed to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. The first attempt did nothing. Adrian's body jerked, but the obstruction held. The second attempt made the boy gag. The third was harder. Then suddenly the lodged piece of food came free. Adrian coughed violently, sucking in air between sobs. The sound of him breathing again shattered the silence like a miracle. Vanessa let out a broken cry and gathered her son into her arms as he coughed against her shoulder, alive, terrified, but alive. Around them, the room exhaled all at once. Some guests clapped weakly from relief, others wiped their eyes. Ethan sat back on his heels, chest rising and falling, his own hands shaking only now that the danger had passed. Ethan looked up at Vanessa through tears, and for one long second the world around them disappeared. Recognition hit him like a blow. He was the cafe waiter, the man she had humiliated, mocked, and dismissed as worthless only hours earlier. Yet when her child needed saving, he had not hesitated. He had not turned away. He had not made her beg. He had simply acted. Ethan glanced at Adrian, then at Vanessa, and asked quietly, "Can he breathe okay?" Vanessa could not answer at first. Pride had no place left in her. The same man she had treated like dirt had just placed her child back into her arms. In front of the wealthiest people in the city, the billionaire CEO who had mocked a struggling waiter could do nothing but stare at him with gratitude, shock, and the first deep crack in the walls around her heart.
Vanessa Hale could not sleep that night. Long after the charity gala had ended, long after Adrian had finally stopped trembling and drifted off in his bed with his little hand still clutching hers, she sat alone in the dim glow of her penthouse living room and replayed the same moment again and again. The panic in her son's eyes, the helplessness that had ripped through her, and the calm, steady presence of Ethan Cole stepping out of the crowd like the answer to a prayer she had not known how to speak. She had built her life on power, on precision, on never owing anyone anything. Yet, in a matter of seconds, the man she had publicly humiliated that morning had become the reason her child was alive. The truth of it left a weight in her chest that no logic could ease. Gratitude was part of it, of course, but gratitude alone did not explain why she could still hear the softness in Ethan's voice when he asked if Adrian could breathe, or why the memory of his tired, dignified face in that cafe now made her feel ashamed in a way business failures never had. By sunrise, Vanessa had made a decision she would normally consider absurd. She wanted to know who Ethan Cole really was. Not the uniform, not the job, not the version of him she had lazily reduced to a mistake and a stain on her suit, but the man beneath all of it. At first, she justified it to herself as responsibility. A mother should know the person who saved her son's life. A proper thank you required more than a rushed emotional glance in a ballroom. But as she instructed her assistant to quietly find out where Ethan worked and how to contact him, Vanessa knew there was something deeper driving her. She needed to understand how a man she had treated so cruelly could still respond with such immediate compassion. A few discreet inquiries later, the picture that came back did not fit anything Vanessa had assumed. Ethan worked not one job but three: morning cafe shifts, afternoon delivery work, evening catering or maintenance jobs whenever he could get them. He was a widower. He had a young daughter named Lily. He had no scandal, no hidden agenda, no criminal record, no bitter story of blaming the world for his losses. Only a trail of employers describing him as reliable, quiet, hard-working, and too proud to ask for help. That should have been the end of her curiosity, but instead it only sharpened it. The following afternoon, Vanessa did something she had not done in years. She drove herself. No chauffeur, no assistant, no polished corporate entrance. Just her, alone in a simple coat, following an address into a modest neighborhood far removed from the steel and glass world she ruled. The apartment building she stopped in front of was old, with chipped paint, narrow stairs, and flower pots on windowsills that looked lovingly kept despite the wear around them. It was the kind of place Vanessa normally passed without really seeing. As she climbed the stairs, she felt strangely out of place, as if the quiet honesty of the building exposed something artificial in her own life. When Ethan opened the door, surprise flickered across his face so clearly that for a second neither of them spoke. He was dressed simply, in a faded shirt and dark jeans, and without the uniform or the chaos of work around him, he looked even more human than she remembered. Tired, yes, but grounded, steady, real. Vanessa had rehearsed several polished ways to begin, but none of them survived the sight of him standing there with his home behind him. "I came to thank you properly," she said at last, and even to her own ears the sentence sounded smaller than what she meant. Ethan hesitated, then stepped aside and let her in. The apartment was tiny compared to anything Vanessa had lived in years, but it carried something her penthouse often lacked: warmth. There were children's books stacked neatly on a side table, a pink backpack hanging from a chair, a half-finished drawing spread across the small kitchen table, and on the fridge a collection of magnets holding up crayon-colored notes and school papers. Nothing matched, nothing was expensive, yet every corner of the place spoke of care. Before Vanessa could take it all in, a little girl with soft dark curls peeked around the hallway and blinked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Daddy, is she your friend?" she asked. The innocence of the question hit Vanessa harder than she expected. Ethan's expression softened instantly in a way she had not seen at the gala, transforming his whole face. "This is Lily," he said quietly, and then to his daughter, "She came to say thank you." Lily smiled with easy sweetness, the kind children offered before adults taught them suspicion, and held up a drawing as if it were treasure. "I'm making us at the park," she announced. Vanessa looked down at the page and saw Ethan sketched with oversized arms beside a much smaller little girl under a bright blue sky. The proportions were clumsy, the lines uneven, but the message was unmistakable: safety, love, belonging. She glanced from the drawing to Ethan, and suddenly the cafe scene returned to her with brutal clarity. Her words, her contempt, her certainty that she had understood him. She had seen an apron and assumed failure. She had seen exhaustion and assumed incompetence. Standing in that little apartment, she began to understand just how blind wealth could make a person. They spoke awkwardly at first. Vanessa thanked him again for saving Adrian, and Ethan, uncomfortable with praise, brushed it aside by saying anyone would have done the same. But Vanessa knew that was not true. Many had frozen, many had stared. Ethan had moved. Little by little, conversation opened. She learned that after his wife died, Ethan had been forced to make impossible choices. He once had ambitions of finishing a professional certification, moving into better-paying work, building the kind of future he and his wife had once imagined together. But grief did not care about plans. Childcare costs rose. Opportunities disappeared. Lily needed him more than his ambitions did, and Ethan chose her without resentment, even when it meant burying parts of himself to keep her world intact. He did not tell the story dramatically. That, more than anything, unsettled Ethan. He spoke of sacrifice as if it were simply what love required. No bitterness, no performance, no demand for admiration. Vanessa had spent years among people who exaggerated generosity and monetized kindness, yet here was a man who had given up his own future one quiet piece at a time for his daughter and never once asked to be seen as noble for it. By the time she stood to leave, something inside her had shifted. She had come looking for the truth behind the waiter. What she found was a father whose strength made the powerful man in her world seem hollow. As she stepped back into the hallway, Vanessa realized with a strange ache that her guilt was no longer the only drawing her to Ethan Cole.
Admiration had begun to root deep and undeniable, and for the first time in years, the billionaire CEO who had everything felt humbled by a man the world had overlooked.
After Vanessa Hale stepped out of Ethan Cole's apartment that evening, the city looked different to her. The skyline was still sharp with glass towers and ambition. Her car was still waiting to take her back to the penthouse where every surface gleamed with success. And her phone was still crowded with messages from executives, investors, and socialites demanding pieces of her attention. Yet none of it felt quite as solid as it had before. For the first time in years, the life she had spent so long perfecting seemed strangely hollow beside the warmth of a small apartment filled with children's drawings and the quiet strength of a man who had nothing to prove. Over the weeks that followed, Vanessa found reason after reason to see Ethan again, though she tried at first to dress those reasons in practicality. She wanted Adrian to thank him properly. She wanted to send a gift and realized no expensive gesture could repay what he had done. She wanted to offer help, then quickly understood that Ethan's dignity would never allow charity disguised as gratitude. So instead, she returned with simple excuses and honest intentions, and little by little what began as guilt deepened into something far more dangerous and far more beautiful. Adrian, still shaken from the choking incident but now openly attached to the man who had saved him, brightened every time Ethan came near. Lily, with the fearless acceptance only children possess, pulled Vanessa into their tiny universe with surprising ease, asking if she wanted to see a drawing, help braid a doll's hair, or taste the cupcakes she and her father had made from a box mix that left flour on the kitchen counter and laughter in the air. Vanessa, who was accustomed to conversations about mergers and market power, found herself kneeling on a second-hand rug while two children argued about crayons, and to her own astonishment, those moments felt more real than the applause of any ballroom. Ethan remained cautious. He was kind, respectful, and quietly grateful for her growing closeness with the children, but there was a line he refused to cross too easily. He had spent too many years learning how fragile stability could be to trust sudden miracles, and Vanessa represented a world that could crush a man like him without ever noticing the damage. He could not forget the way she had looked at him in the cafe, as if his very existence had offended her, and though her apology had been sincere and her recent kindness unmistakable, part of him still feared that whatever connection was growing between them might vanish the moment her polished world demanded it. Vanessa sensed that hesitation and did not blame him. Instead, she kept showing up, not with cameras or gifts or grand declarations, but with consistency. She brought Adrian to the park where Ethan had promised Lily an afternoon on the swings. She sat on the edge of a folding chair at Lily's school recital. She listened when Ethan spoke, truly listened, and in doing so discovered how starved she had been for honesty. For years, people either feared her, envied her, or tried to use her. Ethan did none of those things. Around him, she was not a brand, not an empire, not the woman on magazine covers. She was simply Vanessa, and that simplicity became the most precious thing in her life. But love, once it began to bloom, did not go unnoticed. Rumors started quietly in the outer edges of her world and then spread with the speed of scandal. A board member made a pointed comment about her interesting new company. A society columnist published a vague item about the billionaire CEO seen spending time in a working-class neighborhood. At a private dinner, an investor laughed too lightly and asked whether she was planning to adopt a charity case next. Vanessa kept her expression composed, but each remark cut deeper than she expected, not because they insulted her, but because they revealed how many people in her circle were incapable of seeing Ethan's worth. The true confrontation came during a board gathering when one of her senior executives, a smug man who had long mistaken loyalty for entitlement, bluntly warned that continued association with someone from that background could damage public confidence. Vanessa stared at him across the glossy conference table and felt something inside her finally harden into clarity. The room waited for her to choose what she always chose: image, strategy, control. Instead, she rose slowly to her feet and told them with frightening calm that a man's income had never been the measure of his character, that Ethan Cole possessed more courage and integrity than most of the people seated in that room combined, and that if anyone believed compassion, sacrifice, and decency were bad for the company's image, then the company had a deeper problem than public relations. The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time, Vanessa did not defend her reputation, she defended him. Word of the confrontation reached Ethan before she could explain it herself, and when he faced her later that night, there was emotion in his eyes she had never seen so openly before. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. Vanessa stepped closer, her voice softer than she had ever heard it in the early days. "Yes, I did. Because I spent too long seeing the world the wrong way. I won't do that anymore, and I won't let them do it either." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, as if measuring whether the woman standing in front of him was truly the same one who had once humiliated him over spilled coffee. Then Lily ran into the room with Adrian racing behind her, both children laughing breathlessly, and the sight of them, his daughter and her son, together and happy, seemed to dissolve the last of the fear between them. Ethan reached for Vanessa's hand, not dramatically, not like a man making a grand gesture for the world, but like someone choosing trust one careful inch at a time. She held on just as gently, knowing some things grew stronger not through spectacle, but through steadiness. In that moment, surrounded by children's laughter instead of boardroom applause, Vanessa finally understood what true wealth was. It was not power, it was not status, it was not the ability to command a room. It was being allowed into a life built on love, sacrifice, and quiet courage. The billionaire CEO who once mocked a cafe waiter went looking for a way to repay a debt, only to discover that the man she had looked down on was the one person capable of teaching her how to live with a human heart. And Ethan, the widowed single father who had endured loss, exhaustion, and humiliation without bitterness, found that sometimes love arrived not as a reward for suffering, but as a second chance neither of them had dared to expect. If you loved this emotional story of karma, sacrifice, and unexpected love, subscribe to Drew Daily Stories. Like this video and comment, "Second chances are real," if you believe one act of kindness can change everything.